Hello and welcome to Victor Foxtrot's X-Ray Halo, the occasional podcast dedicated to those people who have shifted the tectonic plates of the VFX industry. I generally find VFX students have little historical context for the business they wish to enter. There's a tendency amongst universities and schools that teach VFX to concentrate on software and immediate industry needs, rather than giving students a wider and deeper appreciation and knowledge of why the VFX industry is as it is, and indeed how they might go on to innovate rather than fall into some more restrictive practices. ScottRoss helped build the VFX industry of today. You can look at Scott's achievements through several lenses: his post as the Senior Vice President of Lucasfilm or General Manager of ILM in the 80s and 90s, someone who helped make ILM into the digital powerhouse of today, or maybe his founding of the world-beating digital domain with James Cameron and Stan Winston, or his work to raise the status of VFX as art and technology worthy of greater recognition within the industry and beyond. Scott has brought out a book that I think all VFX students should read who seek to understand why the industry became what it is today. At just over 300 pages, Upstart, the digital film revolution, managing the unmanageable, crams in as much detail and colour on what was a fledgling industry at the time. It's part autobiography, part business advice, part confessional, part history book. The front cover has a picture of the SS Titanic emblazoned on it, partly because of Scott's pivotal role in the film at the time, but also maybe as a grim metaphor for some of the business practices and corporate cultures of the day that we might explore in this podcast. Hello, Scott Ross.
Hello, Saint. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks, and thank you very much for doing this. I appreciate it. And just reading your book, the book is Upstart, the Digital Film Revolution, Managing the Unmanageable. And I found it refreshing. And as I've said previously, one of the things about VFX students is they have an ahistorical sense of VFX. They don't really understand the history. They're not taught it. And your book, fills a certain gap there. But I'd like to kick off with my questions, if I may.
Sure,
And that
please.
is, why now? Has this book been in gestation for years? What makes it happen now? Because you start the book with the very sad funeral of Stan Winston in 2008. And, that almost sort of, you talk about that almost as if you said, I was ready to look at my life in earnest. And that might have been the point which you'd write a book. So why has it come out now?
So when after I sold Digital Domain, I went, as I said in the book, as I say in the book, is that I went through sort of a period of mourning and anger and all of that stuff. And I needed to be able to get in touch with who I was. I think oftentimes, relatively successful people and leaders believe their own hype. I call it the 11th commandment, thou shalt not believe thine own hype. And so I looked at the world from my point of view, which was I was incredibly successful. I built these great companies. I transitioned ILM into digital. And I thought that my proverbial didn't stink, that I really had it together. I knew what I was doing. And then out of nowhere, um, you know, things really hit the fan and I'm sort of down and out. And I can't quite figure out what it is I can do and where I can go, given my limited skill sets. It's sort of like, yes, I'm a CEO, but can I run a software company? Can I run a studio? And so I was sort of pigeonholed into being the CEO or the guy that started Digital Domain and ran Industrial Light and Magic. And at the time, there were very few companies that would be able to use my capabilities and frankly be able to afford me, right? Because I was playing at the highest levels. I was playing for Manchester United. I was like, I'm not going to go down to the C leagues, right? And so my then girlfriend, now wife, said to me that maybe what I should do is I should start lecturing, and I should, because I was passionate about trying to find some equity for digital artists to have them stop this terrible sort of imbalance of power between the visual effects facility and the digital artist and the production and movie making. And we were always looked as second-class citizens. And she said, well, why don't you go out on a tour and start, talking about it? So I wound up lecturing. And it worked out really well for me because I traveled the world. I went to the UK several times. Um, I went to Germany, I went to Japan, China. I covered a lot of territory and was able to, sort of hopefully spread the gospel about the inadequacies and the really the way that digital artists, particularly in the visual effects industry, were being taken advantage of, and the way visual effects facilities were being taken advantage of by the studios and then governments because of subsidies and tax breaks. So that took up a period of time. And as a result of some of that work, I wound up sitting on boards. So they would ask me, like I sat on the Beijing Film Academy board. I became an advisor to the Lenovo Corporation, and then I headed up a conference called Trojan Horse Was a Unicorn. And so that took a lot of my time, right? And it wasn't until I left Trojan Horse and COVID hit where things really slowed down, and people kept constantly saying to me, because I had written a blog that people sort of followed over the years. I had let it go fallow, but people would say, you need to write a book. You really need to write a book. And with the support of my wife, she said, you really need to write a book. And so that's how it started.
Right. And the thing about the book, which I really like, and I don't know if you agree with this, is it's kind of three books in one. It's a sort of a history and biography of the birth of the modern VFX industry. It's a business leadership guide, and the back cover sort of seems to favour that approach. And then it's also your own autobiography. Is that fair? Is that what you set out to do, or is it just it just so happened that way?
You know, I wound up reading a biography of a woman named Cassidy Hutchinson, and she was the woman who was brought to the January 6th trial, who sort of outed, the Trump administration and her boss, Mark Meadows, and I bought this book and I read it, and in reading the book, I realized that I found her life story as interesting or even more interesting than the machinations that happened in the West Wing and the White House, right? And so when I finished the book, I brought it to an editor, and the editor came back to me and said, the problem with your book, Scott, is that it's a memoir. And he said, and your last name isn't Obama. So you're never going to sell a book based on your memoir. And I said, well, what should we do? And he said, I think you need to go back in and write a business book. You need to pull stuff out. And I thought about it, and I recalled my reading of Cassidy Hutchinson's book, and I thought, if I could tell the story of how to manage a creative business and give a history of the visual effects industry, because I think there's going to be a lot of interest there because it's stories that are untold, and my personal journey, that it's going to be more powerful and more interesting than just of, well, in business we do this.
Yeah, and I think that's true, and giving that context is very powerful. Um, so talking about business and your kind of business philosophy, which really comes through, and at times you call it the rock and roll philosophy. I'm really keen to know more about this. It seems you gained so much from your time at One Pass, which is
Mm.
before you came to ILM, and maybe you'd like to say a bit about that. But sort of how did One Pass shape your philosophy when you actually landed at ILM? What is your rock and roll philosophy?
So let me take it a little bit further back, because I think one of the questions you asked was, who are your business models? Who are the people
Mm,
that you looked up, your heroes in the business world? I had no heroes in the
mm,
business world. I was older than you, and so I was a child of the 60s, and I think that comes across in the book. I never ever thought of myself as a business person. I never saw myself as a management person. My whole essence of who I was a musician, a creative person. I was a counterculture person. So in my soul, I was sort of anti-business, right? Which the irony is that when a digital domain gets first financed, it gets financed by the IBM Corporation, which was the big bad boogeyman of the 1960s and early 70s, big blue, corporate as it gets. So business was not sort of in my makeup. I never understood people who were interested in their life's work as making money. It just made no sense to me. So when I got to OnePass, I was hired at OnePass. Actually, I had was running a crewing business, so supplying television crews for sporting events in the Bay Area. And then baseball went on strike. So I lost my livelihood, which was very meager, by the way. And I had a brand new child and a wife that didn't work outside the home. And so I needed to do something, and I was recruited sort of by this fellow who said, you really should contact the guy who runs OnePass. And so I wound up meeting him, and he was exactly what I thought I wanted to be, minus the gay part, right? He was totally cool and rock and roll and creative and he just had this giant warm personality that everybody wanted to work for him. Everybody wanted to climb the mountain for him. Um, and and that made a really big impression upon me. That's the way one needs to be a leader. And then I wound up sort of climbing through the ranks of OnePass to become its president, partly because of happenstance and partly because of this fellow who was my mentor, Taylor Phelps. I guess saw something in me and gave me a lot of jet fuel. But then when the company wound up being sold, we were sold to a printing company, and this older guy, this business guy, Bob Dellendorf, came in, and Bob was, you know, a dyed-in-the-wool print guy who probably worked for McKinsey at one point. You know, he was a real business guy. And while I couldn't stand him because he was everything I was against, you know, in terms of lifestyle and choices and culture, but he really um, showed me the way to be able to manage a business by numbers, return on investment criteria, you know, all of the things that I would have learned going through a master's of business administration, I learned at OnePass through this fellow, Bob Dellendorf. And so the combination of Taylor Phelps being heart and soul and decent and kind and charismatic, and Bob Dellendorf, on the other hand, being suit and business and numbers, and that was my education. And so when I graduated, I had both of those skill sets.
Yeah, so it was more of a case of role models that you came across
Correct.
rather than reading or qualifications. And you know, this brings us on to something that's very strong in the book, that idea of conflict or rubbing up against the business bean counters. And, you know, that's probably most typified by your relationship with Doug Norby and then maybe later John Texter. The idea of the clash between your rock and roll philosophy of creativity and the more bean counting business that you encountered. Sort of, you know, I think you mentioned somewhere creatives versus suits. Could you give us an example of that conflict from your past, just so people can understand how it was?
Well, if I could give you a little history about why Doug Norby was hired. So, you know, Lucasfilm wound up becoming an organically grown group of companies that, you know, it
Mm,
just sprang up. Yeah, I'm not sure Lucas necessarily had a business plan in mind. What it seemed like what he had in mind is he didn't like the LABS and he wanted to get back to his roots, which was Northern California. And after he made Star Wars, he had the juice and the money and the power and all of that stuff to be able to do it. And so he did. And and in the process of doing that, George was not a business guy either, right? And so I don't think he understood that he needed really, really good management. And so he wound up having sort of not qualified people managing his organizations, in my opinion.
Mm.
And sort of they were looking for a new president before I got there. And one of the guys that was an advisor to George was Doug Norby. And Doug Norby was the chief financial officer of Syntex Corporation, the people that developed the birth control pill. So, he was an ex-McKinsey consultant. So he was really steeped in business, and the confines of his mind about business. And so the Lucasfilm companies, besides George's films, were all losing money. And so he decided, and understandably so, I think, he decided that he needed somebody to stop the bleeding. And so he named Doug Norby as the tourniquet, as it were.
Mm.
And Norby didn't understand creativity. He didn't understand the creative spirit. He was not a good spokesperson. He was the antithesis of what Taylor Phelps was. He was not Bob Dellendorf either, because Bob Dellendorf was that rough and tumble kind of print guy from, the Midwest. This guy was a blue blood, Harvard educated, cardigan wearing, hush puppy wearing, kind of Mr. Rogers on the exterior, but on the interior, a Machiavellian nut. And so he wound up becoming the president of Lucasfilm, and and he and I just didn't see eye to eye at all on anything. But I was so successful at Industrial Light and Magic and swinging the company back around that he saw me as a threat.
So at the same time, he was he kind of helped you form your own philosophy because you kind of knew you didn't want to be like him, right?
Well, I was always the word maverick comes to mind. I was always thought of as a maverick, and I, if there was a situation where things weren't working, I'd figure out a way to make it work. And sometimes I'd figure out how to make it work by breaking the rules. So when I was at Lucasfilm, that's what I did. I broke the rules. I organized a management team, creative team, and technical team around me. And I had our own human resources, our own business affairs, our own legal, and our own finance group. And I operated as if we were an independent company, and and I guess they weren't quick enough to be able to stop me. And once I was able to do that, and the proof was in the pudding, now things were very successful, and the company was healthy and feeling good about itself. And by that point, I think Norby just realized that, boy, this guy's dangerous. I got to get rid of him.
And I guess at that time, from your point of view, there were no rules. There was no rule book of how to do it. You were one of those people who are in a fledgling industry that's just booming. No one's done it before. There you are. You have to create your own rules, right?
It was actually worse than that, Saint, because when I got to ILM was a well awarded industry leader, market leader in an industry that was generally pretty new. But ILM started in Star Wars, right? And so that's sort of the early 70s. And here I came in the early 80s. So the company had been functioning for 10 years.
Mhm.
And as a result of that, um, many had the attitude of, that's not the way we do it, right?
Mhm.
This is the way we do it. And I'd say, well, why is it the way you do it? And they say, well, it's always worked for us. This is the way it is. And don't rock the ship because we've gone down these other paths and it didn't work, but we finally figured it out and this is the way we do it. So now, not only did I have no rules, I had rules that were against the kinds of things that I wanted to do. So I had to convince those, and I had incredible support from people like Scott Squires and Dennis Murin and John Knoll and those kinds of people. And so organizationally within the division of Industrial Light and Magic, um, a lot of the leaders were, yeah, we get the future is digital in fact, we believe the future is digital. Let's move forward.
And that's a good point to bring on to digital domain, because that was very much part of that move. Do you tell us how that happened, how you made the leap from ILM to co-founding a business with James Cameron and Stan Winston?
So when I was at ILM at towards the end, and I think it describes it pretty in depth in the book,
Mm,
is that I wind up being set up by Doug Norby because, and it's conjecture on my part, and he's since passed away, so I
mm,
will never know the truth. But it seemed to me that he was doing his best to figure out a way to make me fail. And so after the success of ILM and the support of the entire staff, he said that I needed to be able to head up Skywalker Sound and THX and blah 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 blah. And when I balked at that, he said that he'd have to fire me. So it became pretty obvious to me that this was a setup. So I wound up taking the job. He didn't pay me any more money. And now instead of one division, I had like five divisions. And and eventually this whole bonus plan came up, and he reneged on the bonus plan to my people. And I thought that was just the last straw because I've been promising my folks that if you work really hard and you do these following things, you're going to wind up with some cash in your pocket. And that included technical, creative, and management people. And once he reneged on that, I figured, okay, now it's time for me to play my, pardon the expression, trump card. And I told him that if he didn't pay the bonuses, at some point we could figure it out. But if he didn't pay it at all, I'd have to leave. And he literally pulled out of his desk my resignation paper. So this was a plan that he had all along. And so now here I was without a job.
mm.
And so I went around trying to figure out what I was going to do and who I was going to do it for. And, I pounded on some doors. I spoke to some headhunters, and nothing came about except there was one job offer to run ShowScan. And I thought, I can't do that. I just ran basically Lucasfilm. I'm not going to take on this failing format ShowScan.
Mm.
And somebody said to me, well, why don't you start your own visual effects company? And I started to do that. I wrote business plans, and I had a mentor to help me. And then Bob Cohn. And then eventually I got a phone call from a fellow named Scott Billups, who's a friend of mine. And Scott said to me, why don't you talk to Cameron? And so the rest, as they say, is history. Now, the Cameron piece came along, and while I was hesitant because I knew who Jim was to an extent, and I was concerned about having a director as my partner. In fact, a side note, I remember when The Mill and Pat and I forget his partner's name, the people that were running The Mill,
Was it
um,
Robin?
Robin Shenfield, right, and Pat,
Mm,
they were thinking about going into business with Ridley Scott, and I was in London at the time, and we had drinks at the Soho Club, and I did everything I could to convince these two guys not to do it, right? Obviously, it didn't work. So now, I have Jim Cameron as a partner, and then lo and behold, out of nowhere, without any conversation, Stan Winston shows up. Now, of course, I'd heard of Stan Winston, famous guy, does great work, but I don't know what value he brings to digital domain. And it turned out that the value that he brought to digital domain, which was not really a value, is that after Jurassic Park, because ILM wound up getting all of the press and Stan did all of the animatronic creatures, that he decided that he needed to get into the CG business as well. So he goes out and hires a bunch of the wrong people and buys a bunch of the wrong gear, and then part of the ticket to ride with Jim was, oh, by the way, you need to buy Stan's gear and you need to hire Stan's people.
Yeah, and it's important to say here for VFX students who are not so long in the tooth as you or I. That's, James Cameron at the time had done Terminator in '84, Aliens '86, The Abyss in '89. I think Terminator 2 was
Terminator 2 in
'91.
92,
Yeah,
91, 92, yep.
and then Stan Winston had a string of Academy Awards. He got the Oscar for Aliens, for the VFX for that, and
Terminator
nominations. I think,
2.
yeah, nominations for Predator and Edward Scissorhands, and then Terminator 2. So these were people who are sort of superstars at the time. They weren't, now we kind of tend to know Cameron for Titanic, and maybe we'll get onto that, but Titanic and Avatar. But at that time, they had a really heavy profile. So um, you sort of mention in the book, as the relationship develops or doesn't develop, in the case, you were surprised at how you were kind of left to run Digital Domain. They weren't hands on; they were there in the background, and maybe also they seemed to be acting in ways that worked against the company, if anything. Um, Looking back now, was this a case of you not being business-like enough? A lack of clarity on of contracts and responsibilities. And if so, is there a lesson there for groups of friends or kindred spirits going into business together today? So, what would you advise to people who are, a bunch of pals today who want to create a business like you did back in the day?
So let me take it back to Jim, why Jim gets involved. I
Yeah.
mean, from my point of view, I needed to have Jim get involved because he was maybe not king of the world, but he was prince of the world at the time. And in Hollywood, particularly, celebrity doesn't talk, it screams, right? And so the opportunity for me to raise funding by myself and or even hire appropriate personnel by myself would have been much more difficult had I not had Cameron's name attached. So once Cameron came, and I walked carefully into it, and then Jim is very charismatic and incredibly brilliant. And once I got to know him a bit better, I was quite taken by the fact that he was going to be my partner. Stan, on the other hand, I lovely guy, became a good friend, wonderful human being, but I didn't really see him offering anything to Digital Domain. But it was part and parcel. If you wanted Jim, you needed to take Stan. So there was a compromise there. It turns out that Jim's, and why I'm talking about it, because I think one really needs to understand what your partners or friends bring to the table and what it is they're looking for. So what's their give and what's their take, right? And so now in retrospect, I understood what my take was from Jim. It was his name that brought me the financing. And I had no illusions that Jim was going to help me manage this company, right? In fact, not only did I have no illusions that he was going to help me manage it, I didn't want his help managing the company. He was a director. And the last thing I needed was, General Patton telling me what to do. I also knew that Stan had his own company, and I didn't really want his help in managing the company, right? And so then the question was, well, what did Jim and Stan want out of this? I think Stan was easier because we talked about it. He needed to offload $1 million worth of hardware that he bought erroneously and a staff of people that he hired erroneously. So I think that's what he got out of it. Plus, it was pretty exciting for him because, here was this brand new company and it was shiny and it had IBM and it looked good on the resume. Jim, on the other hand, I believe Jim saw George Lucas as his hero. And Jim wanted to be able to be like George Lucas. And he saw George Lucas having Industrial Light and Magic, and he wanted his Industrial Light and Magic, which was Digital Domain. Difference between George and Jim was George owned Industrial Light and Magic outright, and George covered all of the expenses and shortfalls that Industrial Light and Magic had on a personal level, wrote checks. Jim had no skin in the game. He put no money in. He just attached his name and also got a sweetheart deal for any of the work that he would bring to Digital Domain. And he wasn't even obligated to bring the work to Digital Domain. So, that was the zeitgeist of the way the partnership worked. The other problem is that because they didn't really have any active interest in it, which was all well and good by me, there was also there was also an organizational structure called the operating committee, which sounded like it was really a great idea when we first started, which was really we shouldn't allow our board of directors, the IBM Corporation and later Cox, to be able to define the company and give it direction, and that it really should be people in the movie industry. And who better than Jim and Stan and Scott to do that? So it sounded all well and good, but what happened is that Jim and Stan really were not involved in helping manage the company, as I said, which was great. But anytime there was an operating committee meeting where the three of us got together, which was very rare, and usually was around issues facing our work on a Jim Cameron movie, um, it was always 2 votes to 1 because Stan would vote with whatever Jim had to say, right?
Mm.
And which is another Hollywood thing, which is the big swinging what in the room is the guy that gets all of the votes, and Jim was that guy. And in fact, in a lot of ways, Stan Winston's career was defined by Jim Cameron. He won his Academy Awards because of Jim Cameron, right? So so Stan always sided with Jim Cameron. So I guess the advice is that when you're looking at your friends, you really need to assess from a business perspective and or a creative perspective and a management perspective what these men or women are bringing to the party and what it is that they want out of it and get very clear. So when you make the decision to bring them into the inner circle, you know what the inner circle is going to look like.
That's great advice, and I must say, in the book, the twists and turns of that relationship are very well explained. So we needn't go too far through that because people can read it in the book. So thank you very much. It's very easy to sort of think of the digital domain time as being, this dysfunctional relationship, but of course you achieve so much in that time as well. From your point of view, looking back now, what were your main achievements at Digital Domain? How do you describe that time?
The easy things are to say the movies and the Academy
Mm,
Awards that we've won and the software that we wrote, but
mm,
from my heart and soul, it's the fact that we built a culture and that culture still exists today, 30 years after, right? So there are people that get together, and some of the leaders in the industry now are all Digital Domain employees. They were hired, and some of them, like Jeffrey Bauman, who's been nominated for an Academy Award. He was a facilities janitorial guy at Digital Domain. It's like so the Digital Domain ethos and culture still runs deep, and people get together and they celebrate it, and there's parties and there's dinners, ex-Digital Domain people. Uh, Marriages, there have been a bunch of marriages that came out of it. There are children that have been born as a result. Houses have been purchased. So it's the real important stuff, not just the Academy Awards, not just the technology that was developed, not Nuke, for example, which is the
mm,
industry, sort of flag bearer for compositing, all got its birth at Digital Domain. But the soul of the company, the culture, what we stood for, the fun. And it wasn't all fun and games. I have to tell you, we worked our butts off, and
mm,
some of us got exhausted and slept on the floor. And it was all of that. But in retrospect, it was the best of times. And I
mm.
think the folks that work there feel the same way to this day.
Yeah, and again, that really comes across it in the book. And I think the first movie you did was True Lies. Was that right?
Correct. Well, yeah, the first movie we did, actually, there was a another movie which I forget what it was, but the
mm,
first
mm,
real big
mm,
movie was
mm,
True Lies, correct?
mm. Yeah, yeah. And I think in the book you talk about the jump jet or the Harrier jump jet
Harrier Jump
scene
Jet.
as well. Yeah, that was great, amazing. Okay, so you know what's interesting also about reading the book is how at times you're kind of one can almost sense a bit of despair from you about the VFX industry's lack of collectivism and unionization, the ability to collectively improve conditions. Do you ever consider defecting to another industry which was maybe more mature, a bit like Norby did? Doug Norby went on, I think, to pharmaceutical and to semiconductors, etc. Could you have ever done that?
Well, if one sort of has to recall my sensibilities, who I was
Mm,
culturally. So,
yeah.
you know, the thought of going on to a different, first of all, I didn't have the CV that
Yeah,
Doug
okay.
Norby had. So Doug Norby graduates from Harvard with an MBA, and Doug Norby becomes a consultant for McKinsey,
Mm,
and Doug Norby becomes the CFO of Syntax. So he was able to move through industries. I was pigeonholed.
mm,
I was the film tech guy, right?
mm,
And so maybe today, if I was a younger man, I would have had some great opportunities. But at the time, there were 7 or 8 companies around the world doing what we were doing, and they were my competitors, and I was a fierce competitor. So they didn't like me very much. I was the team that they always tried to beat and never could.
mm,
So the opportunities weren't really there. And then I wasn't driven by, being the CEO of a pharmaceutical company or even a cybersecurity company. It just, it didn't, light my
mm.
candle, as it were.
Yeah, look, well, let's just keep going with this corporate mentality thing because there's a great quote in the book which you say in 1993 I could see a corporate mentality descending on all the other companies in our industry like a dark cloud. These days we seem to have a much more HR friendly industry, at least from my point of view in the UK. We have HR departments and an awareness of well-being and mental health procedures and all those things that clearly weren't around, in your day. You mentioned about mental health in a couple of times. So do you think things have actually got better for the average digital artist?
I'm sort of out of it now, so I really couldn't give
Mm,
a definitive answer. But I've often said a lot of people, particularly the digital artists, say, "Gosh, you were working in the golden age
mm,
of visual effects," and my response was, "It was pretty terrible back then. People worked like crazy hours at crunch time. We didn't have the tools that you have. On the other hand." We got to live in a home and not travel around the world and be digital gypsies. We didn't sit in a dark room for hours and hours and hours and hours, only to have our shots thrown out by a director some 6,000 miles away. So I would say the old days were pretty bad, and the new days are even worse. I actually don't think it's gotten better. I think there's it seems to me that there is a lot of sort of corp speak around it and HR. We had HR departments. Listen, when
okay.
I was at ILM, we were a union shop, right? So um, it just seems like the work has become more and more difficult. The amount of it is overwhelming. The expectations continue to be off the charts. I mean, Victoria Alonso was well known at Marvel. She worked for me as a production coordinator, right? Was well known as really pressing people, and a lot of folks came out and were very upset. But there's still no trade association in the U.S. There's no real, union, and the truth of the matter is the problem is the business model. The business model in and of itself creates all of these other issues: the overworking, the underpaid, the overtime, the lack of respect. All of that comes from the business model.
And I think in the book also you talk about that, especially towards the end, and possible solutions as well to that. So what's changed in terms of the business model since 93, for instance? What's changed? Because we've had the huge digital revolution, which the book is partly about as well. But what are the sort of what's the hope on the horizon?
Well, let's first say what's changed. I think things have gotten worse. For
Mm,
example, given the business model and the way it works, a visual effects studio winds up carrying the financial brunt of the visual effects work, but has none of the authority to determine when it gets released, when it's finalized, what the work is, etc. So it has all of the responsibility and none of the authority, and therefore you get killed on a bottom line, on a business level.
mm,
Additionally, at least back in the day, we were able to front load things, right? So we would be working on projects A, B, and C, and losing money or not making very money on A and B and C. But now we had got project D, E, and F, and we would front load the payments of D, E, and F to wind up paying for A, B, and C.
mm,
So at least we had that flexibility of being in the cash flow management business, which kept us alive, which ultimately, in my opinion, was the death of Rhythm and Hughes.
mm. Yeah, of course.
Um, so I don't think it's better now.
Mm,
It's actually worse because the studios won't allow that anymore. And I think the demands are as high and the deadlines are as strict. So I'm not sure it is better today. And then there's this looming scary thing called AI, which it's if in fact the studios and the client's main interest is I want it cheaper, I want it faster, and I want it good. And the old saying is you could choose two. Generally speaking, the studios will choose cheaper and faster. So what does AI do? It makes things cheaper and faster because the most expensive part of a visual effects production is the personnel. So if you could eliminate 50, 60% of the personnel that are doing sort of rote tasks, and by the way, that model has been put into place to an extent with taking all of those rote tasks out of first world countries and bringing them to third world countries. And that was the solution during most of the 2010s, right? And that's why we saw these giant facilities spring up in places like Pune or Mumbai or places like that. And when AI tools now come into place, those folks are going to be replaced. And so I think the first people that are going to get hit are those third world, second world countries that have built these giant facilities, and those folks are going to be out of work. I foresee 50 to 60, maybe 75% of all visual effects workers being without a job in the next 5 years with the advent of AI.
that's very very sobering, and a number of people share that view. Can you foresee, with uh, maybe with a trade association or some sort of collective action, a positive coming out of AI if people get together and use it in a certain way? Can you see? I mean, there are a number of VFX houses now who are sort of claiming to be AI focused.
So, well, you're talking about using AI tools to create visual effects or
Yeah,
visual effects?
generative AI. Yeah.
Generative AI.
Mm,
So, all we have to do is look at the previous strikes of the Screen
mhm,
Actors Guild and the Writers Guild of America, for example. The majority of the issues surrounding those strikes were as a result of their concern for AI. And they have a guild or a union, and they were able to negotiate with the studios sort of guardrails that allowed them to make sure, at least in the near future, to make sure that AI didn't take the jobs away from writers or actors or whatnot. Well, the visual effects industry doesn't have that. And since they don't have that, without any guardrails, the studios are going to do what studios do, which is take advantage as much as they possibly can, even at times killing the golden, egg. Well, my analogy is bad, but scrambling the golden egg, right? And so that's a real problem. So again, I think a a international trade association could do that kind of thing. And I
Mm,
think a union also could do that kind of thing. By the way, one of the things people have said about this International Trade Association, which I've been on now for like 25 years, they all think, well, the reason Scott Ross wants that is because he wants to run it. Fuck no. I do not want to run that. I do not want any part of it. You could ask me as a strategic advisor, but thank you very much. I'm really happy playing music and I'm really happy playing golf and I'm really happy living in Santa Barbara and I want no part of that. So it's always funny. They're always looking at, what's the ulterior motive? I have no ulterior. My ulterior motive is to fix an industry, right?
mm,
That's my ulterior motive. Um, in terms of visual effects facilities embracing AI, I sit on the advisory board on a couple, and they are, of course, embracing AI. And it's going to be pretty interesting and exciting. But the embracing of AI will cost people jobs.
mm,
It will replace, that's the purpose of what AI is in visual effects, is replacing. And if we think that generative AI is going to allow visual effects companies to be more creative, um, they've got another thing coming.
mm.
Because generally speaking, visual effects companies are not core creative people.
In terms of sort of like business models and changing the business models, diversification, is that a valid tactic for VFX houses? Framestore, for instance, and a number of other companies now do VR or theme park rides. Um, but it's surprising how still siloed a lot of VFX companies are. Um, why aren't there content creation companies making entertainment across the arts? It's the same kind of software they're using, animation, VFX games, etc. There doesn't seem
So,
to be any
so
any huge.
do me a favor, saying define content creation companies.
Oh, okay, developing your own IP, for instance, or making a game or making a film, etc.
Yeah, so that's always been the chasm, right? The chasm
Mm,
is if we let's look at over the last 40 years, the great visual effects companies, and coming out of those great visual effects companies, how many multiple Academy Award winning visual effects supervisors have become successful directors? Yeah, less than I can count on my hand. Did
mm,
Rob Legato become a successful director?
mm,
No.
mm,
Right? Did Dennis Muren? No. Kenny Ralston tried it, that didn't work.
mm,
John Bruno tried it, that didn't. I mean, so to 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 assume that just because you're in the visual effects world, I use an analogy in the book of the Venus de Milo, right?
mm,
It's like, if we're given the Venus de Milo and we're told, could you do me a favor and add arms? That's one thing. But if you're given a block of marble and a chisel and a hammer, that's something very different. And so I've not yet seen very many people make the transition of being a world-class visual effects supervisor or artist and become a director. There are a handful, but only a
mm,
handful out of tens and tens of thousands of artists that have worked over the last 40 years. Um, I do think diversification is good, and that's one of the things that I think I brought to ILM and definitely structured around digital domain, which is um, if you have a tool set that could apply to multiple industries, why not take advantage of that? Why
mm,
not have another revenue source? And particularly because, the movies is such a lightning rod from a perspective of people that want to be around it and be excited by it. So if your company did Titanic, shouldn't you also be doing commercials? Shouldn't you be doing theme park rides? Shouldn't you be doing VR? Um, and the answer is yes, you should be doing all of those things.
mm. you mentioned in the book sort of phenomena. I think I've also seen, which I call the glamour phenomena, and that is that young people want to come into the industry because they love films, they love certain directors, and because of that, they're sort of willing to take conditions which might be substandard to them. Um, you mentioned about AI taking over, and I also detect a number of young people are thinking, I'm not going to go into the VFX industry because it's going to be, disintermediated. It's going to disappear. What do you say to that? To those kind of people? To would you persuade those kind of people to still get involved with the VFX industry?
No, I would not.
Hmm.
No, I would not. In fact, years ago, there was a country western song. It was "Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys," right? That was the sign. And so I borrowed that and I said, please let your babies grow up to be digital artists, because there was a desperate need for talent. As we transitioned from analog to digital, and as the industry blew up from a movie that was like 50 shots to a movie that was 500 shots, we needed people on a global basis. Um, I would say to my grandsons, if they wanted to be in the visual effects industry, is don't do it. Find something else to do, um, something that's not going to sort of sap your soul, and you're going to be a happier person. You need, sort of life work balance, and and the truth of the matter is that it's a fantasy that you think you're going to go work at Pixar and that you're going to be, Brad Bird or somebody like that. Chances are you're going to move Woody's eyebrow. You'll never speak to the director. You'll never meet Tom Hanks. You'll be stuck in a room. And is that fun? Is that the reason you're doing this? Are you so enamored with the possibility of saying I work for Lucasfilm that you're willing to sit in a dark tunnel for the rest of your life? No, no.
Okay, thank you. I think we got the message very clear there from you. That's great. So, uh, talking about creativity and yourself, I know you developed a. I think you developed is it a script or a concept, Cranes, which was based on your experiences in Japan. Um, do you still hold out hope to see that, you know, come onto the silver screen, or do you think the industry is too broken because, as you said, you've been siloed, you're the sort of VFX tech guy, so you're not seen as a creative, so do you still hope to see your idea on the big screen?
I have 4 or 5 different scripts that I've helped develop and, wound up raising development funds. And,
Mm,
one of them is a story about ping pong and the
okay.
1971 Chinese, sort of American ping pong diplomacy. And I have Janet Yang, who's the president of the Academy, is my co-producer with me, and we're in the middle of a rewrite now, and I think that will ultimately get made. It's sort of, in my opinion, a no-brainer, and I've got the juice with somebody like Janet being my partner. Um, I have a project called Yeshua, which is the story of the missing years of Jesus's life from the
Ah,
time he's 13 to the time he's 30. That's a bit more difficult, but I have Christopher Doyle, the fabulous cinematographer, who did the
oh,
DP, and we're out for directors, and so there's a possibility there. I guess the I have Martin Campbell, the great director, attached to A Thousand Cranes. So the nice part about having developed a script and is that I'm not having to deal with all the craziness that's Hollywood and LA. And I've figured out a way to be able to have people that are excited about my projects and go out there and hit the pavement. And so I don't even have to hit the pavement. So have I given up hope? No. Am I realistic? Yes. I mean, Cranes came about like in 1998, 1999, And here we are, however many, 26, 7 years later, and it's still not made. Though it went through quite a bit of trial and tribulation to get it from Texter, who held on to it for so many years. But I don't give up hope. No, I don't.
That's very heartening to hear. Um, you mentioned it in the book that you originally set out to prove it was possible to have both a thriving creative spirit and a thriving, well-managed business. Who do you think fits that bill today? When you look around, uh, who are the sort of the role models, if you like, who are both creative and great at business? Would you say?
Well, the guy who was my protege at Industrial Light Magic and One Pass is a
Mm,
fellow by the name of Jim Morris, and
hmm
Jim is the president of Pixar. And
mm,
so I think Pixar is a company that, in many ways, lives up to that. Now, Jim's not the maverick that I was, and he's not as rock and roll, though he's definitely musical and a very cool guy. Um, but I think that the Pixar company has a really great culture, or did. I'm not quite sure what happened with the Disney acquisition, but it definitely had a really great culture, and there's no arguing with their track record of the films that they've done. So it's got a great campus, a great sensibility, a collaborative feeling amongst people, and I think probably that's the example I would use.
any examples outside of one of the media industries? Do you think? I mean, everybody talks about Steve Jobs, for instance, but and some people talk about Elon Musk. I don't know.
I think Steve and Elon are assholes, and so that's some severe narcissistic personality disorder problems, and I can't imagine that working at Tesla with that fellow at the head of Tesla is actually a wonderful, warm, creative, embracing, cool company to work for. I could be wrong. I don't work at Tesla. I don't know of anybody who does, but it's hard. I think, I hope it comes across in the book is that the leader of the company is the person that sets the culture and tone, and that if it stinks from the head, it probably stinks. So Steve Jobs created and built an incredible company. And I have a good close friend, Trip Hawkins, who is the
Mm.
chairman of EA. And he was one of the original employees there. And it was probably as exciting as all hell. But, Steve was not a very nice person. I always thought it was funny that back in the day, I was a big Apple acolyte, and I thought Bill Gates was the bad guy, because he was corporate. And well, it turns out that Bill Gates is the good guy and Steve was the bad guy. You can't judge a book by its cover. Um, but yeah, I would say even back in the early days of Disney, Disney was that kind of company, you know?
Mm. Okay. I think I've got one more question for you. You might be relieved to know, but it's the last question on the back of cover of your book. How would you answer it? And I'll say what it is. It says on the cover of your book, it goes, it lists a few questions, and again, it very much pushes the business entrepreneurial side of the book, which I think is strong. But the question I'm going to ask you is, how might creative tech businesses begin to challenge traditional business paradigms?
Well, I think again it has to do with management and
Mm,
leadership. And so, if you have a traditional tech business that is either headed up by somebody that has a narcissistic personality disorder, that everything is about that person, that's not going to work. Or I think even worse than that, if you have a business, a tech business where the leader is the Doug Norbies of the world, where it's they can't, they have tunnel vision, they can't see, they don't understand, appreciate the creative soul. They're not in tune with who their employee base is. That's disastrous. So a lot of it's going to have to do with who is the leadership in the company, and are there employees that feel like they have a voice in the leadership and a voice in the running of the company. And to do that, management needs to be able to embrace key employees and have them aware of the problems and issues that they face, right?
Mm.
So if the employees are over at one side and they're looking up to up the hill, to the shining light on the hill, and they're thinking, boy, I'm like working my butt off, and those guys are driving like Ferraris. What the hell is going on? There needs to be openness and a lot of communication.
And again, I'm going to push you on a sort of a question here about the current state of the VFX industry. And as we all know, the top 20 of the greatest grossing films of all time are all
Right.
have heavy VFX in some way. But at the moment, when you look at what's out in has been put out at cinemas in 2024 and is about to be put out in 2025, would you say VFX industry is in a good place in terms of the kind of visuals that you see at the cinema now?
Are you asking for the me? Am I blown away by the quality of the work that's being done?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, generally speaking, of course.
Hmm.
It's always moved forward in terms of quality. Sometimes there's too much quantity for
Hmm.
quality. And as I always used to say, I used to lead companies that made the best part of some pretty bad movies. So that's the other issue. The other issue is, I used to say, people would say, yeah, I saw that movie you guys were involved in. God, it really didn't work. I said, we don't write them, we don't shoot them, we don't edit them, we don't compose the music for them. What'd you think of the visuals? So, I think visual effects are getting better and better and better and better. And stories are getting worse and worse and worse and worse.
Well, on that note, I'd just like to say once again, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and all that experience. And it all comes out in the book. And I'm going to tell all my students to get a hold of a copy, and hopefully a load of universities and schools will also, because it is a really interesting read from both the point of view of, the autobiography, but also history of VFX and, how business has developed as well. So thank you very much for writing it, and thank you very much for your time, Scott.
Thanks, saying, hey, by the way, I hope you can put a little blurb on the bottom of this podcast of where you could get it on Amazon.
Okay, I'll do that, certainly.
Thanks. All
Okay,
right.
thanks a lot. See you.
Have a good one. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.